Let's get into the conversation about coalitions. I must remind you, 64 municipalities are hung. That means there is no outright winner. At least that's as things stand, with the counting basically nearly done. And this then reminds us of the conversation, or should I say the conference that was held last year in November by the South African Local Government Association in partnership with other organizations. And let's speak to SALGA's Lance Jewell. He is the COO of that organization. Lance, a very good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. Let me kick off this conversation with that very conference you held in November last year. I'm reminded of Terry Tselane, who once led the IEC. His words were that South Africa has reached a point where it needs to start institutionalizing the role of coalition governments. That means, in one of his recommendations, that there needs to be an establishment of the office of the registrar of coalitions. Do you think that time has come?
Well, good morning, and good morning to the viewers. Perhaps to start with the conversation we convened last year. Effectively, it was a conversation to reflect on the 20 years of local government that we celebrated on the 5th of December last year. And indeed, part of the conversation was we can no longer ignore the realities that comes with no party being able to secure a majority. Now, if you are suggesting what Terry is suggesting along the lines of a registrar of coalitions, it may be where we are heading towards. But as SALGA, we think before we get there, and because of where we find ourselves now, because that is more of a long-term plan, there may be a need to deal with the current realities. And for us as SALGA, we had worked with the Dula Oma Institute from the University of Western Cape and come up with something that could assist political parties almost immediately to in a more framed way, deal with coalitions, both the setting up as well as the sustaining of coalitions. So we are quite interested on sharing that particular guideline.
So, Lance, where does this conversation need to start then? Or, let me be much more practical, if this office of the Registrar of Coalitions is to be established, whose responsibility is that?
Well, that's an interesting question because the reality is that we are talking about developments in the political space, and you would have seen. Just give the example of the recent developments around the IEC, where yes, it is effectively an independent body, but it has come under tremendous pressure in the recent past. And we should be mindful that when we try to establish offices of that nature, we must also keep that risk in mind that you are talking about a political space and people are quite opportunistic to pass the blame to an independent entity. And I'm assuming this would typically be an independent entity. But I think we are a far cry and a far way from that point. For us, the starting point is to in fact introduce a legislative framework. So put laws in place that will guide the formation of coalitions, but also provide guidance on how do we sustain those coalitions, because the reality is the coalitions do come with, if they are not grounded and if they don't have a proper foundation, they do bring about instability that ultimately impacts on service delivery for communities. So it would be necessary for us to perhaps look at a legislative framework, and we can take cue from the guideline that we have developed together with the Dula Oma Institute.
Lance, let me remind you why this was the suggestion by Terry Tselane, and in part he said the following, that this must be done in order to ensure stability, service delivery and good governance at all spheres of government. And if we use the example of the 2016 local government elections, the coalitions that have been formed since then, chaos perhaps is not even the word to start describing what they have been like. Are you telling us right now, as things stand, that there are no laws that govern how these coalitions ought to be managed?
Well, you are correct. There is no legal prescript. There's nothing in the Constitution. There's nothing in the local government-related legislation. And it doesn't only apply to local government level. It applies across all three spheres of government. There's no legislative framework. And therefore, you would see parties are making up the rules as they go on. So that is what we need to rescue. The counter proposal that could be made, why are we focusing on the registrar for coalition governments? What would be the core purpose? Is it to ensure that there's transparency? Because you don't necessarily need a registrar to obtain transparency. What we are suggesting in our framework is perhaps that for every single coalition agreement that is entered into, it must be made public so that there's more transparency, but also it promotes accountability. We don't need a registrar for that. We just need the parties to say, this is what we have agreed to as this coalition government, and this is the program that we are going to drive over the next 5 years or for the lifespan of this particular coalition. It does not necessarily need a registrar. So in our view, there is already sufficient basis in our guideline to try and assist not only the formation, but also the sustainability, but also ensure that communities themselves, the electorate, draw satisfaction that indeed the parties that they have voted for are doing the right thing whilst they are in office.
Lance, at the point of disagreement, where we even saw in the case of Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, a total collapse of governance as far as the coalition government there, at the point of disagreement, which perhaps would even lead to a dissolution of council, what other dispute mechanism is there except to go to by-elections? Because if that is the solution of holding by-elections, if there is a total collapse, again, that doesn't guarantee that there will be an outright winner. So we're in a mess.
Well, essentially, the collapse of a coalition government because of disagreement between the coalition partners, it does not necessarily result in a by-election, because unless there is a vacancy that is created in a political office of a councillor, there is no need for a by-election. What we are saying as part of the guiding framework to political parties is during the formation stage, there are three key things that must be done. The first one, agree on what are the common areas that you would want to drive as this partnership. Secondly, also agree to disagree on areas that you are not having the same views on, so that it is quite upfront the areas that are areas of disagreement and will not find expression during the lifespan of this particular coalition, so that you manage those areas and try and drive the areas that have been agreed upon. And lastly, it is a mechanism, agree upfront, not when the concerns arise, when there's conflict. Agreed upfront what would be the dispute resolution mechanisms, so that all coalition partners are on the same page that says the agreement between our states specifically, should there be disagreement around key aspects of this coalition, this is the mechanism we are going to use. And that mechanism would have been defined upfront, because you exhaust that mechanism first so that you can try and keep the coalition government afloat, instead of, in the absence of a dispute resolution mechanism, it automatically results in the collapse of that coalition government. So we are trying to introduce mechanisms to at least ensure more stability during the lifespan of that coalition. But yes, it is a political space, and sometimes we do not all respect what has been agreed to. But if it is on paper and everyone has a common understanding of what the coalition government is anchored on, I think it puts those parties in a better space to be more stable throughout the lifespan of the coalition.
Finally, and very briefly, if you can, Lance, your role as the South African Local Government Association, do you play any role at all in the management of these coalition governments, or are these left to political parties to try and sort out among themselves, if indeed there are areas of dispute?
Well, because it is largely a political space, we do not get involved in it. But what we would do as an association of municipalities, and in fact that would be our deliberate priority over the next period, is to provide direct support as we speak to those 64 councillors that would be hung, so that at least on an ongoing basis we can try and mitigate against the collapse of coalition governments and provide the support. But we try and stay away from the detailed and conversations, but also trying to coordinate and facilitate those conversations. It's not a space appropriate for us as an association.
Lance Joel, thank you very much for your time. Chief Operations Officer of the South African Local Government Association. It is a worrying factor indeed that there simply are no laws that govern these coalition governments, and so something needs to be done very quickly. 64 hung municipalities. That means there is no outright winner. If the chaos of the past term is anything to go by, well, we're in for much bigger chaos.